Picture this: May 1st, 1994, San Marino Grand Prix, Imola, Italy. Ayrton Senna, three-time world champion and the greatest driver of his generation, is leading the race when his Williams Renault suddenly veers off the track at Tamburello Corner at 135 miles per hour and slams into a concrete retaining wall. The impact is catastrophic. A suspension arm pierces his helmet. He suffers a basilar skull fracture. Senna dies before the helicopter reaches the hospital. Brazil loses a national hero. Formula 1 loses its biggest star. And the entire motorsport world realizes the sport has become too dangerous to continue without fundamental change. What makes this death the catalyst for the most comprehensive safety overhaul in racing history is that it happened one day after Austrian driver Roland Ratzenberger was killed during qualifying at the same circuit. 2 fatal accidents in one weekend. The killer weekend at Imola wasn't a freak occurrence. It was proof the sport had normalized deadly risk as part of the spectacle. Post-crash investigation determined Senna's steering column likely failed due to a poorly executed pre-race modification, shifting blame from driver error to mechanical failure and inadequate technical oversight. The finding was damning because it meant Senna died not from the inherent danger of racing at high speed, but from preventable engineering and regulatory failures. The emotional impact was staggering. Senna was beloved in Brazil as a symbol of national pride, someone who represented the country on the world stage with grace and dominance. His funeral drew 3 million people. The grief was so profound, it forced immediate institutional reckoning. Within days, the Grand Prix Drivers Association, dormant for years, was re-established to demand safety reforms directly from the FIA, the sport's governing body. The response was swift and sweeping. The FIA implemented emergency rule changes mid-season. Engine sizes were reduced to limit speed and power. Cockpit sides were raised to protect drivers' heads. Suspension systems were reinforced to prevent wheels detaching during crashes. Circuit design was revolutionized. The deadly Tamburello Corner, where Senna died, was immediately redesigned into a slower chicane with extended runoff areas. Concrete barriers were replaced with energy-absorbing barriers designed to reduce impact forces. Track safety standards were overhauled globally, requiring greater runoff zones and improved crash protection at every circuit. These changes weren't optional upgrades. They were mandated because Senna's death made it politically and morally impossible for the FIA to continue operating under the old safety standards. The result was a 20-year period without a single fatality in Formula 1, the longest safety streak in the sport's history. Senna's death also laid the groundwork for future innovations. The Halo device, introduced in 2018 to protect drivers' heads from debris and impacts, descended directly from the post-Senna safety philosophy prioritizing cockpit protection. When Romain Grosjean's car split in half and burst into flames during its 2020 crash in Bahrain, he walked away with minor burns because the Halo and survival cell kept him alive. That survival cell exists because Ayrton Senna died at Imola. The worst part is Senna knew the sport was too dangerous. Investigators found an Austrian flag in his cockpit that he planned to raise in honor of Ratzenberger after winning the race. He was racing while mourning a fellow driver killed the day before, aware of the risks, and then became the second fatality of the weekend. His death forced Formula 1 to stop accepting deaths as the price of speed. February 18, 2001, Daytona 500 final lap. Dale Earnhardt Sr., 7-time NASCAR champion and the sport's most iconic driver, is running third behind his son Dale Jr. and Michael Waltrip when his car makes contact with Sterling Marlin and Megan veers into the wall at turn 4. The hit doesn't look that severe compared to other crashes in the race. Earnhardt's car doesn't flip or catch fire. It just slides down the banking and stops on the infield grass. But when safety crews reach the car, Earnhardt is unresponsive. He's pronounced dead at the hospital. Cause of death: basilar skull fracture. The same injury that had killed several drivers in previous years. The same injury that a device called the Hands, Head, and Neck Support System, invented years earlier, was specifically designed to prevent. And Dale Earnhardt, known as the Intimidator, the toughest man in racing, wasn't wearing one. Neither were most drivers. NASCAR didn't require it. The death of NASCAR's superhero on the sport's biggest stage during its most watched race created a moral crisis the sanctioning body couldn't ignore. For years, the Hands device existed, but wasn't mandated, because NASCAR operated under a culture where drivers managed their own safety. Veterans like Earnhardt resisted wearing the device, calling it uncomfortable and restrictive. NASCAR didn't force the issue. The philosophy was that if a driver chose to race without certain safety equipment, that was his decision. Earnhardt's death shattered that philosophy because it proved that leaving safety up to individual choice gets people killed. The injury wasn't random. Basilar skull fractures occur when rapid deceleration causes the head to snap forward violently, tearing the skull away from the spinal column. It's a well-understood biomechanical trauma. The HANDS device prevents it by tethering the helmet to a collar that distributes deceleration forces across the shoulders and torso instead of concentrating them at the base of the skull. The technology worked. It was available. NASCAR just hadn't made it mandatory. Earnhardt's death made it impossible to continue that policy. The response was rapid and absolute. On October 17, 2001, less than 8 months after the crash, NASCAR mandated the HANDS device for all drivers in its top 3 series. There was no phased implementation, no grandfather clause. Every driver had to wear it. The mandate was supported by driver testimony. Jeff Gordon credited the HANDS device with saving his life in a subsequent crash, proving the mandate worked. But the reforms didn't stop with head and neck restraints. NASCAR accelerated development and deployment of safer barriers, steel and foam energy reduction systems designed to absorb impact energy and reduce the forces transmitted to the car and driver. Tracks across the country installed safer barriers on high-speed sections, fundamentally changing how circuits managed crash energy. Then came the car of tomorrow, later evolving into the Gen 6 car, which incorporated advanced safety cells and structural integrity improvements informed by research conducted after Earnhardt's death. These cars were designed with driver survival as a primary engineering goal, not an afterthought. The cumulative effect has been profound. No driver has died in NASCAR's top series since 2001. When Ryan Newman crashed violently on the final lap of the 2020 Daytona 500, his car flipping and landing on its roof after being hit by another car at nearly 200 miles per hour, he survived with minor injuries. The HANDS device, the safety cell, and the safer barriers kept him alive. Dale Earnhardt's death bought that survival. NASCAR's greatest champion died so future drivers wouldn't have to. January 13, 1968. Minnesota North Stars vs. Oakland Seals. Bill Masterton, a 29-year-old center, carries the puck into the offensive zone when he's checked by 2 opposing players. The hit isn't illegal or particularly violent by hockey standards, but Masterton falls backward and slams the back of his unprotected head against the ice. He's unconscious before his body stops moving. Massive head trauma. He dies 30 hours later without regaining consciousness. Bill Masterton is the only player in National Hockey League history to die from injuries sustained during a game. That fact alone makes his death the defining moment in hockey safety. But what makes it especially significant is how long it took the NHL to respond. In 1968, almost no NHL players wore helmets. The culture of the league, dominated by old-school veterans and owners who viewed toughness as essential to the sport's identity, considered helmets soft, unnecessary, even cowardly. Players who wore them were mocked. The prevailing attitude was that if you needed a helmet, you weren't tough enough to play professional hockey. Masterton's death immediately sparked debate about mandatory helmet use. The mechanism of injury was obvious. Unprotected head impacts ice. Brain suffers catastrophic trauma. The solution was equally obvious: require helmets. But the NHL didn't mandate helmets. Not after Masterton died. Not the following season. Not for 11 years. The league finally implemented a mandatory helmet rule for the 1979 to 1980 season. But even then, it was a compromise that reflected how deeply entrenched the anti-helmet culture was. The rule applied only to players entering the league starting that season. Veterans who were already playing could continue without helmets if they chose. This grandfather clause meant players competed without head protection well into the 1990s. More than 2 decades after Masterton's death proved helmets were necessary. The resistance wasn't based on evidence or safety data. It was purely cultural. Helmets were seen as contrary to the sport's tough guy identity, and the league refused to override that perception even after a player died from preventable head trauma. But Masterton's death did accomplish something critical, even if the institutional response was delayed. It made head injuries a persistent topic of discussion within the league and the broader hockey community. It established the baseline understanding that brain trauma was a serious, often fatal risk, not just part of the game to be accepted. That cultural shift, slow as it was, eventually led to the comprehensive concussion protocols the NHL adopted starting in 2011. The protocol mandates that any player suspected of suffering a concussion must be removed from play and evaluated by medical staff, with return-to-play decisions based on clinical assessment rather than player or coach preference. It's not perfect. but it represents a fundamental change in how the league treats brain injuries. Masterton's legacy is also honored through the Bill Masterton Memorial Trophy, awarded annually to the NHL player who best exemplifies perseverance, sportsmanship, and dedication to hockey. It's a tribute to a player whose death should have immediately changed the sport, but instead took more than a decade to force meaningful reform. The lesson from Masterton's case is that even when the evidence is undeniable and the solution is available, cultural resistance can delay life-saving safety measures for years. Hockey eventually got there, but only after wasting 11 years and risking countless additional injuries that helmets could have prevented. November 13th, 1982, Caesars Palace, Las Vegas, lightweight championship fight. Ray Boom Boom Mancini versus Kim Duk-koo, a 23-year-old South Korean challenger. It's a brutal, bloody war. Both fighters absorb devastating punishment for 14 rounds. The 14th, Kim collapses. He's carried out on a stretcher, unconscious. Emergency brain surgery reveals a subdural hematoma, severe bleeding between the brain and skull caused by cumulative head trauma. 4 days later, Kim dies. His mother, consumed by grief and guilt over her son's poverty-driven choice to pursue boxing, dies by suicide 3 months later. The referee, Richard Green, tormented by the belief he should have stopped the fight sooner, takes his own life the following year. 1 boxing match, 3 deaths. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that the fight was televised and watched by millions. Viewers saw Kim absorb punch after punch, round after round, his face swelling, his legs weakening, his defense deteriorating. They watched him collapse. The brutality wasn't hidden. It was broadcast. And the extended human cost, including his mother's suicide and the referee's guilt-driven death, created a moral crisis boxing couldn't ignore. The central question wasn't whether boxing was inherently dangerous. Everyone knew it was. The question was whether the structure of championship fights, specifically the 15-round format, made the danger unnecessarily lethal. The answer was obvious. The greatest risk occurred in the final rounds, 13 through 15, when fighters were exhausted, their bodies and brains already battered by 12 rounds of cumulative trauma. By the late rounds, defensive reflexes slow, punch resistance diminishes, and the ability to protect oneself deteriorates. Fighters in rounds 13, 14, and 15 aren't competing at peak ability. They're surviving on willpower while absorbing brain damage that becomes exponentially more dangerous as fatigue sets in. Kim's death proved that extending championship bouts to 15 rounds didn't test greatness. It tested how much neurological trauma a human could endure before catastrophic failure. The response was swift. Within months, major boxing organizations, starting with the World Boxing Council, mandated the reduction of championship bouts from 15 rounds to 12. It wasn't an equipment change or a rule tweak. It was a structural intervention designed to limit the duration of exposure to repetitive brain trauma. The reform acknowledged that boxing's inherent violence had acceptable limits, and 15 rounds exceeded those limits. The reduction to 12 rounds became the global standard. Beyond round reduction, Kim's death prompted stricter pre-fight medical requirements, including mandatory electrocardiograms and neurological testing to screen for conditions that increase the risk of catastrophic injury. These requirements formalized medical oversight that had previously been inconsistent across jurisdictions. Boxing remained dangerous, but the reforms meant fighters faced slightly less cumulative risk per bout. Kim Duk-koo's death is remembered as the event that ended the 15-round era. Every championship fight since has been 12 rounds maximum, because one 23-year-old from South Korea died in the 14th round, and the world decided that was too far. The sport didn't eliminate the risk. It couldn't. But it reduced the exposure, and that reduction has likely saved lives by preventing fighters from reaching the point of total physical and neurological exhaustion that killed Kim. He died so future champions could fight shorter, slightly safer battles. June 26, 2003. FIFA Confederations Cup semi-final, Lyon, France, Cameroon vs. Colombia. 72nd minute. Marc-Vivien Foé, a 28-year-old midfielder, is jogging near the center circle when he suddenly collapses. No contact, no collision, he just falls. Medical staff rush onto the field and attempt resuscitation. They work on him for 45 minutes. Nothing works. Foé is pronounced dead. The autopsy reveals hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a hereditary heart condition that thickens the heart muscle and increases the risk of sudden cardiac death during intense physical exertion. Foé had no symptoms. No warning signs. He passed routine medical checks. He was a professional athlete in peak physical condition, and his heart killed him in the middle of a match watched by millions. What makes Fouet's death uniquely significant is that it shifted sports safety from external trauma to internal pathology. Helmets protect against hits. Barriers absorb crash forces. Rule changes limit exposure to violence. But Fouet's death proved that some of the deadliest risks in sports are invisible, undetectable without specific medical screening. The problem is, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and similar cardiac conditions are often asymptomatic. Athletes can live with these conditions for years without knowing. The first symptom can be sudden cardiac arrest during exercise. By the time the heart fails, it's often too late. Fouet's collapse demonstrated that reactive safety measures, waiting for an injury to occur and then responding, don't work for cardiac conditions. The only effective strategy is proactive screening to detect silent killers before athletes compete. The response transformed global soccer medical protocols. Governing bodies, including FIFA and UEFA, mandated comprehensive pre-participation cardiac screening for professional players, typically including electrocardiograms designed to detect structural and electrical heart abnormalities. The screenings aren't perfect. Some conditions remain difficult to detect, but they identify a significant percentage of at-risk athletes who can then receive further evaluation and, if necessary, be restricted from competition or provided with tailored medical oversight. The reforms went beyond screening. Fouet's death highlighted the critical need for immediate emergency response during matches. Even with a cardiac event, survival is possible if defibrillation occurs within minutes, but that requires trained medical personnel and accessible equipment. In response, professional soccer mandated the presence of medical teams and automated external defibrillators at all high-level matches, positioned pitchside for immediate deployment. The effectiveness of this post-Fouet protocol was proven dramatically in June 2021 when Danish midfielder Christian Eriksen collapsed during a Euro 2020 match against Finland. Eriksen suffered sudden cardiac arrest on the field. Medical staff immediately initiated CPR and used an AED to restart his heart. Eriksen survived. He later received an implantable cardioverter defibrillator and eventually returned to professional soccer. His survival was a direct result of the medical infrastructure and emergency protocols implemented after Marc-Vivien Fouet died. Fouet's death redefined what sports safety means. It's not just about protecting athletes from the violence of the game, it's about identifying and managing invisible physiological risks that can kill without warning. The mandatory cardiac screenings and pitchside AEDs that now exist across global soccer weren't standard before 2003. They became standard because a 28-year-old Cameroonian collapsed in the center circle and didn't survive. Fouet's legacy is measured in the athletes who've been screened, diagnosed, and saved before their hearts could fail. He died so others could be tested. And Christian Eriksen walked off the field alive because those tests and that emergency response infrastructure existed when his heart stopped. 5 deaths, 5 sports. 5 reforms that saved countless lives. Ayrton Senna's crash forced Formula 1 to redesign cars and circuits. Dale Earnhardt's fatal final lap made the HANS device mandatory across NASCAR. Bill Masterton's fall eventually brought helmets to hockey, though it took 11 years. Kim Doku's collapse ended the 15-round championship era in boxing. Marc-Vivien Fouet's cardiac arrest mandated screening and defibrillators across global soccer. Each death exposed a fatal gap between known risks and safety standards. Each forced institutions to stop accepting preventable tragedies as the cost of competition. These athletes didn't just die, they became the catalysts that rebuilt safety in modern sports.